Good evening. I call the December 17, 2024 special call board meeting of the Richland 2 School Board of Trustees to order. The agenda for this evening's meeting has been published and made available. May I please have a motion regarding the approval of the agenda? May I please have a motion regarding the approval of the agenda?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mrs. Nash.
I move to approve the agenda for the December 17th, 2024 special called board meeting.
The motion has been made. Is there a second?
Second.
The motion has been made by Mrs. Nash and seconded by Mrs. Washington to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? Is there any discussion? Board members, please vote. And if we need to do a hand vote, we can do that. So all in favor, raise your right hand. That's 6 yes, 0 no. The motion passes. We will now move to executive session 3.1. May I have a motion to go into executive session?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mrs. Washington.
I move to convene an executive session for the purpose of discussing the superintendent's goals.
The motion has been made by Mrs. Washington. Is there a second?
Second.
The motion has been made by Mrs. Washington and seconded by Mr. Dennis to go into executive session. Is there any discussion? Board members, is there any discussion? Seeing none, we will take the vote. Board members, please vote. All in favor, raise your right hand. The motion is 6 yes, 0 no. Mr. Trapp is not present with us at the current time. The motion passes. The board will now enter into executive session. May I have a motion to end executive session?
Chairwoman.
Yes, Mr. Dennis.
I move that we adjourn executive session at 7:32 and resume public session.
The motion has been made by Mr. Dennis. Is there a second?
Second.
The motion has been made by Mr. Dennis, seconded by Mrs. Porter to end executive session at 7:32 and resume public session. Is there any discussion? Is there any discussion? Board members, please vote. And I need to see if I'm still on. Mrs. Nash has left for this evening. Thank you. The motion is 7 yes, 0 no. The motion passes. We will now resume public session. We will now move to item 4.0, new business, no action requested. And 4.1, discussion, continuous improvement plan. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to call up the Jen Square. That's Jennifer, Mrs. Morrison, and Ms. Dr. Coleman. They are going to answer and do a short presentation and answer any questions the board has on our continuous improvement plans.
Thank you for the opportunity to share how we're supporting schools for continuous improvement, both those schools that have state designations and all schools in the district as part of our system. Dr. Moore and the academic department are working hard to be intentional and strategic by creating an overall system which includes differentiated supports for schools and principals as part of that work. During tonight's presentation, you'll hear about our state and federal designations, schools with those designations, our continuous improvement system, and tiered support for those schools, and how it's differentiated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Coleman.
All right, good evening. So one of the fun facts about the state of South Carolina is we actually had state accountability and report cards before any other state did in the nation. So the Education Accountability Act of 1998 actually established the creation of school report cards annually. So we've been at this a while as a state. During, so about 2001, No Child Left Behind came out, and that was one of the first pieces of federal legislation that mandated that states have accountability systems and report cards. Of course, No Child Left Behind has morphed into Every Student Succeeds Act. We still have the Accountability Act of 1998 in our state, and our state legislation, our General Assembly, will also do delegations of school designations based on report card ratings. So, now buckle up because there are a whole lot of ratings. I'll go through them quickly though. All of the ratings that are established, some are established at the federal level, some are established at the state level. So this screen here shows a state designation. So remember, the state report card that each school gets has an overall rating and then sub-ratings for different categories. So these designations are created on the overall ratings. So the first one that we'll talk about this evening are underperforming schools. And that is any school that is below average or unsatisfactory on the state report card. Those are the two lowest levels of the ratings that schools can get. This is an annual identification, and we currently have 8 schools that were designated recently as underperforming. Chronically underperforming are schools who have 3 consecutive years rated as unsatisfactory. We have none. Underperforming districts are districts who have 65% or more schools below average or unset. We are not there. The reason that I present the bottom 2, well, one, I really hope we never get there, and hopefully the plans that we've put in place will prevent that. But those actually have some really strict state interventions that start coming forward. We're not there yet, but I do like to just make sure that our boards are aware of the consequences that can come. Those include things as turning them over to charters, state takeover. Again, we are far from that. We're doing all right when it comes to that. Now, we also have federal designations. Okay, these are a little more difficult to understand, so I'm going to go to my handy-dandy slide. You guys know, Dr. Moore, if I could have a board right now and some paper, I would be drawing my pictures. Okay, here's what I want you to imagine. So you take all the elementary schools in the state of South Carolina. So everybody gets an overall rating, and it also has an index that's between 0 and 100. So what they do is they rank order all the elementary schools. They do this for middle and they do this for high. And what they say is, where is that cut point at the bottom that deems you the lowest 5th percent of that section of schools statewide, okay? So see my little line there? That's the cut score. So let's say that score is a 17.82. Now I'm gonna go back to my previous slide. One of the things that they do, the first is CSI schools, so that's Comprehensive Support and Intervention. These are Title I schools that are performing below that bottom 5% statewide, or a high school with a grad rate below 70. These are 3-year designations, so we have none to report on this evening because we are mid-cycle. So when you start having these designations that have 3-year cycles, nothing happens for the 2 years after identification. The next identification is actually this school year, and it'll be based on SC Ready 2025, okay? But we have none from the previous year's identification. The one that you have heard us talk about is ATSI. So ATSI is additional targeted support and improvement. So, go back to my handy dandy picture. One of the things that No Child Left Behind did back in 2001, which was great, is they said, you're going to stop lumping all your kids in together and telling us scores. We want to look at subgroups. So the federal government has predefined subgroups. They're the standard racial subgroups, special education, pupils in poverty, multilingual learners. And so what happens for the ATSI schools is, remember, we have this ranking, we have that cut line. What ATSI does is it takes each of those subgroups and says, is your subgroup doing worse than the school that's in that lowest 5th percentile cutoff statewide? Okay? So they're mid-cycle as well, but when it was identified 2 years ago, we did identify 7 schools in the district through the special education subgroup. So there's nothing to report this year because it's not an identification year as of yet. That will be, when I'm here this time next year, we'll be having a conversation about schools exiting and potentially schools entering that cycle. And the last one that's a federal designation is something called Targeted Support and Improvement Consistently Underperforming Subgroups, so TSICUS. So this is actually an annual identification, and I'll go ahead and tell you we have not gotten this from the state yet. We are still waiting on it. We think it will come when we come back in January. Yes, Miss Washington, those eyes are the same eyes we give when they're like, oh my gosh, we have to turn this thing right around real quick. Now, full disclosure, the data analysis that we do internally with subgroups, we already know. And we have an idea, but that formal announcement doesn't typically come from the State Department until January. So the TSICUS is, again, that whole subgroup concept, but are you below the 10th percentile? So remember, the first one was the 5th. This one's a smidge higher, so it's almost like a warning group. All right, you're not below the 5th, but you're below the 10th, so you're not heading in a direction we want to see you head in. And we had 6 of those identified in the last cycle, and they were all identified based on special education.
So one of the things to, going back to Dr. Coleman's explanation of state and federal designations, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is our schools may have more than one designation. So you could have a state designation and you could have that federal designation as well. And we do have 3 of our 8 underperforming schools that also have an ATSI designation for special ed. And certainly, if you think about the overall system, if special ed in the general education classroom is a concern, that creates a concern school-wide that would be tier 1, which oftentimes might lead to a state designation. So thus, the work that we're doing around our special education program. So what we really have to think about, though, is it's not just about getting a designation or not getting a designation or waiting for the state or the federal government to come up with what that actually needs to be. Really, every school in our district needs to be focused on all students being successful in that tier 1 straight up instruction that everybody has, and needs to be focused on that continuous improvement every single year. So we're not declining, we are moving up always. And especially because things don't stay static, right? So our population doesn't stay static, our teachers don't stay static, culture does not stay static. We've got to be in a process of continuous improvement all the time. So the system that we have in place, or that we're building this year, and that where we have all kinds of written plans around, and that we're instituting and trying out a lot of things this year, really focuses on all schools in Richland too. Continuous improvement in every single school that we've got. And that comes with making sure that we have tiered or differentiated support for different groups of schools. Not every school needs the same thing. So we've got to make sure that all our groups of schools have that tiered or differentiated support. For example, every school that has an underperforming designation, we made sure that we pulled a team together that was very well defined to really support the school in creating a really good continuous improvement plan, not because that had to be submitted to the state, but simply because we want to make sure that each and every child is successful in that school. So those plans had to be actionable, they had to be reasonable, they had to utilize resources that we already have in the district, and so those were the plans that you approved on the consent agenda at our December 10th meeting. And so a lot of work went into that, but that was part of our differentiated support for those schools. So we also, in the continuous improvement system, leadership is always the foundation of where a school goes and how a school does. There are a lot of contextual factors that have changed over time, and our leadership teams are really adjusting to a number of those factors. But when we think about our continuous improvement systems that we started building this year, it really focuses first on the leadership in the building, not just the principal, but the entire leadership team as defined by the principal, which may include some teacher leaders at times and things like that, because that is the foundation for movement in a school. Also, we need to make sure that those changes, that system, that what's happening in a school is not based on assumptions about how kids learn and how things are and how things work and those kinds of things. I mean, there are some basic truths in the world about how people learn and how people function, but when we start basing things on assumptions, then we're not hitting it. So, for example, people look at me sometimes and they assume things about how I speak, what I look like, all these different things, and you would assume things there. But what people don't realize about me, for example, as a learner, was my first language was not English. So that is, you can't make assumptions based on previous experience, how people look, how they act, those kinds of things. You really have to be data informed when you're making decisions. So we're really looking at that as part of continuous improvement. This is being led by the entire academic department, friends, which includes pupil services, special education, magnet programs, all the various folks that we have in our academic department, and it's making it so much stronger. And then finally, part of our continuous improvement system at every year is really involving a good cyclical review of programs within our district and how we are serving schools to make sure that what we're doing with assessment, what we're doing with curriculum materials, what we're doing with instructional support, with coaching and with professional development and learning, that those things are actually what our schools really need to move forward. So that is continuous improvement. So those are the big pieces of our system. And then so you can see tiered support means that all schools don't get the same thing. But there are certain things that all of our schools do get in the district. There's good baseline support, and we want to make sure that that's in place. So you can see on this slide that there are things that we do for all schools, and then if we're thinking about our underperforming schools that have the continuous improvement plans at the moment, these are things that are happening specifically for them that may be different, because that support needs to be different and more wraparound. And so you can see here that for all schools, we operate using a school renewal plan, but for underperforming schools, there's that additional layer. All schools participate in a regular schedule of district specialist support. In our underperforming schools, there's increased support. All schools have district-created professional learning. We've had a lot of requests, very specific requests from our underperforming schools about the kind of professional learning they need specific in their schools, and we're making sure that that is happening. We have data meetings in every single school in the district, and that's, I think, relatively new to the district. However, we have that in place, but our underperforming schools have additional support. We have a very strong team set for each school. And all schools participate in regular monitoring, and then we have some increased monitoring in our underperforming schools. And then all of our schools utilize SPED inclusion, where you have teachers pushing into classrooms, or a variety of different models for that. All of them have that as an option. However, our underperforming schools are using that as a requirement. It is something we're really moving and measuring as we move forward with inclusion in our district, and I really do think that they'll probably show some strong data about how that might work in all of our schools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Moore and open up for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Morrison. So board members, I hope that you can see from the discussion or the presentation our focus and the work that we're doing now to support our schools. And I want to thank Dr. Coleman and Ms. Morrison for putting the legs to the vision that I've cast for them. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Board members, are there any questions? If not, okay. Mrs. Porter?
I just wanted to say thank you, and it looks like this is a very thorough plan and much needed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, board members?
I have a comment.
Yes, Mrs. Williams.
I echo Mrs. Porter's. I just want to say thank you. Just listening to the presentation and the details that you gave really aligned with the goals that you have. And I read all of the continuous improvement plans, and to see how the goals were very SMART goals and how the action steps were aligned, and you could tell based on the data that was given in the top part of it that the principals and whoever was on the staff was very intentional about creating their action steps to align, and it didn't cost additional money, which I was very appreciative of. So I did read all of that. So it didn't cost, cost us like additional money besides what was already allocated to them, and being intentional about that. So I really, really appreciate that. I do have just one question, and I see that you all are using Gold Book, and then the inclusion model side. It's been proven to be very helpful for our students, especially students with disabilities. How are teachers being trained on that, and are y'all using Stetson and Associates to help with that process?
So I'm going to answer that question. So Gold Book is being used in all of our ATSI schools. So those are the same schools that are instituting inclusion as well, and it's being used with special education teachers right now to help them. It's kind of an AI-powered program that helps teachers write very standards-based IEP goals, which is very different than what has been done in the past. So oftentimes an IEP goal will be based specifically on skills that a student is learning, but you know our issue. Our issue is not necessarily particular skills. It is really that tier one standards-based level of rigor that is really needed. So Gold Book is a really important tool right now to make sure that those IEP goals are very standards oriented. And there are also a lot of pieces in Gold Book that we've been talking with schools about possibly using with their gen ed teachers, with their general education teachers as well. One of the things that I want to be really careful about as Dr. Moore's a senior chief of academics is sometimes we just need to be careful about creating confusion in the field because there's so many tools out there. And y'all bored. So many tools out there, so many tools out there. So Gold Book is fabulous in a lot of ways. And I want us to be get good data this year about how it's working in schools and where it might need to go, and then be strategic about potential spread or implementation in future years as we proceed with the work that we're doing. So does that answer all parts of your question, Ms. Williams?
It does, and the last part was for the inclusion and training. Mm-hmm. Were you all using an outside source to help with that, such as Stetson? Right.
So Stetson was our vendor for the special education division last year. We did need to, because of procurement rules, we needed to get a new vendor this year. I don't have that name at the top of my head, but I'm happy to put that into board brief, and I'll make sure that I do that. Mm-hmm.
Board members, any other questions? Well, I would like to say thank you also for the presentation. And I know it's always going to be great when Dr. Coleman comes up.
That's right.
So Always wonderful. So thank you for that. But I have a question. I'm not sure if you can answer or Dr. Moore. But when you put on there focus on principal and leadership teams, what exactly are you focusing on? And with some of those teams, are you looking at their skill set? Because I do think that's so important when you go through the schools and you see some of the leadership teams and you see some that's strong in some areas or some that's only strong in the same areas, and you're thinking, you know, someone needs to go over to another school that can help that school out. I mean, I do that all the time, and I just keep it in my head. So if you guys can just talk to me about what are you looking for when you're focusing on the principal and their leadership teams.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moore, because I'm sure she has some comments related to this. But one of the things that we knew for this year, and I'm just going to do a side real quick. I just want to make sure that it has been such a fabulous honor to work with our principals and leadership teams and this year, and they have been brought along every step of the way and have been very open to a lot of the moves that we're making. So I want to make sure that we're clear that this is not really something that's being done to, it is really being done with, and our principals have been very supportive. So back to your question.
Practice. That to and that with. Love to hear about restorative practices.
Very important.
So thank you.
All right, and so then to answer your question, so we knew something needed to be tied with our continuous improvement system and the work that we're actually doing there. And so Dr. Moore and Dr. Franklin have been very open to allowing time in our district principals meeting for some very, very strong professional learning for principals. And so what we've been focused on in every single month in those district principals meetings. So Dr. Moore does a good piece around leadership and using Maxwell's work and a variety of things, and then generally the academic team will follow up with work around the principal going back to their leadership team and doing very, very strong professional learning with their leadership team. And we give them all of the materials for this. And it's around the systems that they're working on in their schools this year. So our first system one was during the last principals meeting, and it was around systems for teacher retention. Then we have systems for Tier 1 instruction, systems for developing teacher efficacy with data, systems, all the systems that our principals want to work this year. And I had them, I say I did this because I actually did do this, but we wanted to make sure there was a measure at the beginning of the year to the end of the year in terms of what principals were doing with their leadership teams. So we have data from the beginning of the year showing ratings of where their leadership teams are when it comes to use of data, which is key to the success that we want, because we don't want to base it just on experience and assumptions. And so we have those ratings. We'll do the PD, continuous improvement, all year long. And then one of the big district pieces of data that we'll look at is end of the year ratings of where our APs, our assistant principals, and various members of the leadership teams are in that same area. So the goal this year is principals working with their leadership teams around use of data, which is a big part of our continuous improvement system, and then those big systems that need to be in place. Schools can't run on a piecemeal basis. There have to be very, very strong systems that are tuned in to the actual students that we have, not the students that we wish we had. So the actual students who are amazing and fabulous in our schools. So with that, I'll turn that over to Dr. Moore.
And what I would add, board members, is Ms. Morrison and I meet. We discuss what the training is going to look like, what role I play in that, because I start their process off for them by casting that vision or sharing with the principals the expectations and why we're doing the work that we're doing. And what's key to this is that the principals, based upon what they see in their school, that's what they are working towards. So they have identified areas that they feel that they need to work on to improve their leadership team so that that team can then drive the instruction in the building to achieve the results that we need to have. And so, as Ms. Morrison said, I also do the professional development to build their capacity as leaders within the building, to add more tools to their toolbox. But our principals have been very receptive, and I know that they have taken these messages back into their schools, because on a school visit recently, I went into a data meeting and they were talking about Tier 1, Tier 2, and instruction. And when I said 80%, they all knew what we were talking about, what the research shows. So the process that we've put in place, the systems that we put in place, is really designed to increase the skill set, Dr. Scott, that you asked about, of not just the principal, but the leadership team within the building. In addition to that, Doctor, I already promoted you, Ms. Morrison meets with the executive directors for secondary and elementary, so that we're not working in silos, we're working together, because academics is going in and talking, but then the principal supervisors are also meeting with the principals and supporting them. So what we're doing is building a cohesive structure in which we are giving our leaders the support that they need to accomplish the goals that we have established for them.
Board members, any other questions? Not, thank you so much. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move to 4.2 discussion, board goals. And I will pass this over to Mrs. Porter and Mrs. Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So every year the board sets goals, and last year we set priorities. Mr. Kenyon, did you get that, Doctor? Thank you. Last year we set priorities, but we want to go back and start from the beginning of where we started, just to show where the board has started, where we're headed, and what we're going to do tonight is we are going to look at our 4 priorities that we have selected as a board, and that was based on a matter of factors. It was based on the IG report and some feedback. It was based on input from our community, and then it was also based on some collaborative effort of the board. So I just want to start in January 2023, after the new board was elected, we have 4 areas that we wanted to set some goals around, and that was recruitment and retention, safety and security, academic achievement, and interventions, including SEL. And so, not to go through each of these, but some of the goals that we set included sign-on bonuses. And that year, we met that goal because we implemented bringing on sign-on bonuses. That helped with recruitment and retention for Richland too. In addition to that, there were some safety things that were happening. We brought that up, we discussed it as a board, and decided that we would implement metal detectors in all of our high schools. For the academic piece, we talked about at the beginning of the school year, or 2023-24 school year, that we will begin looking at some data for our pupils in poverty. Now, if you see something that says goal is not met, it's not because we didn't work towards it. It was either a time constraint, there was something that was happening. For instance, we were bringing on Dr. Moore, hiring a new superintendent, and so some of those goals did not get met because we had additional priorities that we had to focus on. And then in addition to that, the board will approve more FTEs for behavior interventionists. That also happened over the course of that 23-24 school year. That was included with the ESSER funds. Those positions continue to be improved or approved through the through ESSER funds, and then some additional funding. And then in spring 2023, the board sat down and we looked, this was after we looked at all of the different data components and looked at our past goals, and we determined that as a board, we wanted to focus on academics, human capital, financial accountability, and safety and security. And so this past year in January, we set a variety of goals. We talked about tackling issues that schools were facing, and we got some reports from our superintendent on, what is it that the different advisory councils officials, that what were they saying were some of their concerns. And so that goal was met. One of the goals that we did not meet, and it wasn't because there was not any effort, it was just because timing, we were bringing on a new superintendent, she was getting acclimated to the district, and that one goal was talking about the strategic plan. She did do a lot of reorganization and different things as far as her priorities go, but this year that is something that we will be working collaboratively with our superintendent to focus on. And then another goal, as you can see, we talked about establishing norms for the board, and that goal was met as well. And so I wanted to bring this up because in order for you to set the tone for the future, you've got to look back at the past and look at what were priorities, and then we can look at those priorities, and there may be something that we may want to go back and address that we didn't do, or there may be something that we may want to that we did meet, but maybe we want to dig a little deeper into that. And so I wanted to make sure that we brought that information to the forefront. And so our next steps for tonight is we want to look at establishing goals for our priorities. We talked about every 2 years we will look at goals for the board because the board changes possibly changes every 2 years with the election process. And so we want to look at safety and security. And I put some examples here below. These are not things that we necessarily have to focus on, but these were just some general samples of things that we can focus on and really flesh these out to be actual goals and priorities instead of them just being topics that we focus on, but that we really look at each priority and establish a vision for it. So what would safety and security in Richland 2 look like for us as a board? Maybe it's us reducing the number of incidents across our schools. Maybe it's making sure that every year we're ensuring that we have protocols in place. Establishing a safety and security committee. Looking at health and well-being of not just our students, but also our employees. Student achievement, regularly reviewing data for trends and areas of improvement. Some of these things we actually already do, but it's good for us to say that this is something that we're going to stand for and be committed to for the next two to 4 years as board members. Financial transparency, looking at budget priorities, looking at stakeholder engagement, looking at financial reports, and how do the financial decisions that we make impact our student outcomes. And then human capital, recruitment and retention, employee well-being, employee satisfaction. We know that there are a number of things that are already in place, but as a board, what are those things that we want to say that we want to be rooted and grounded in so that it will help us to continue to move forward in the vision that we have for the district and in the work that we do. So we have 8 chart papers, but we're only going to use 5 of them tonight. So each chart paper will be listed with one of these priorities. I'm going to ask the board members to select a colored marker, and Ms. Porter, jump in and correct me if I'm giving these instructions incorrectly. And for each priority, really think about what is it that you would want to see us do collectively as a board and focus on. If you see that Mr. Trapp has already written something and you agree with it, don't write it again. Just put a star by it. So that way we don't have a long list. If there's something that maybe Mr. Trapp has, but there's like some addition that you may want to add to that, feel free to jot that down. But we're going to kind of do this little gallery, this, thinking, and then this gallery walk of looking at what all we put down and taking that information and coming up with our collective vision for each priority. The 5th one is for what are those things that we need to focus on in terms of governance. Some people brought up we need to go back and review policies. Some people brought up that, we have the safety committee, they've got goals that they want to establish. There may be some other things that you're thinking about that internally, leadership may be one, that you may want us to focus on as a board for this year, for 2024-25. And then those are the things that we can just continue to review and continue to measure our own progress. But for those big goals, for that big vision, for those priorities, those are the things that will help us stay rooted and grounded in the work that we're doing so that we know what the end goal is. It is purpose-driven, future-ready students. And I feel like those 4 priorities are the things that will take us in that direction. So is everybody clear? Go ahead, Ms. Porter.
I just wanted to restate what we're about to do.
Yes, thank you.
So, and I'm going to need the help of my colleagues here, and I'm going to have you go ahead and start at one of the chart papers and then tell you which item you're going to write in the center and circle it. Ms. Washington, if you could go ahead and take on safety and security and put the name in the middle and put a circle around it, and then and you can go ahead and start there and write some items. And I love that we stopped at this page where it says goal setting and some of the samples that Ms. Washington provided. You're welcome to add those to that chart paper or ideas of your own. And remember, if you read somebody else's and you agree with it, put a star. That's very important to what we're about to do. And so if Ms. Washington's already started, if Mr. Dennis, if you want to go ahead and go up there and put miscellaneous and start yours. Ms. Williams, if you want to start with human capital and name it and start on that. That way we're all spread apart. And Dr. Scott, if you'd like to start with academics, I know that that's important to you.
Can I get the students to come up and help me with the academics?
All right. And then you go ahead and start with your ideas. And once you're finished, you can move on to the next note and add your ideas. All right. And then Mr. Trapp, if you want to go ahead and do the fiscal accountability and start there, and then I'll join you, Mr. Trapp, there. And miscellaneous, the one that Mr. Dennis is working on, is for anything that we have not included, but you have thoughts about. And so you can just add anything. What's that? Oh, I don't know what our time limit is, but I'll kind of feel for it and say switch or something along those lines. All right, so Mr. Trapp, you and I can go ahead and hit that middle one. All right, thank you. And just in case you were wondering, I do have Ms. Nash's ideas, and then I'll add them to the butcher paper as we go. All right, you have about 30 seconds to make your final selections. Okay, so we're going to take pictures of these to make sure that everybody has it, but I'm going to review it for the community, the ones that we have multiple stars on. Is that okay? Okay.
If you can just list all of them, regardless of how many stars,
Oh,
because I
okay.
think it's important that they know how we're thinking and what we're thinking.
Okay, should I
And
state
then we
how
will
many?
later come back and share about the stars and different things to generate.
Okay, do I need to share now which
No,
ones have the most
if you can just
stars?
share
Okay,
each component and then what's listed under there.
got it.
Thank you.
Okay, so just so that you're aware what's going on and what people are saying on the board, we have for miscellaneous ideas, and some of these may be items that need to go on others. We have more community partners and educational opportunities. Board members, bus ride to neighborhoods of our students, like the bus tours. Monthly team building activity for board members. Policy rework. Community town halls. Superintendent and board visits. Make them instructional led with discussions. Engaging stakeholders, communication. An SOP for communication. Board meetings twice a year held within the community. Okay. Safety and security, we have metal detectors in middle schools, meeting twice a year with legislators, partnerships, a safe summer event, family intervention and care solace community promotion, reducing the number of expulsions, reviewing district safety plans, social emotional well-being, special needs focus groups. Fiscal responsibility, audit, analysis. Quarterly reports and updates, monitor budget to ensure student outcomes are met. Student academics, we have discipline, policy and based on instruction, reducing the number of CSI schools, magnet program review, SPED performance, policy with focus on behavior, teacher feedback for PD, goal setting that is measurable, internship and mentorship for all students, purpose-driven, future-ready, board scholarships for students going into education through the Education Foundation. Summer programs revamp, especially middle and high. Educational opportunities for expelled students. Human capital, we have employee SEL, retention, respect for the profession, I'm thinking in education, advancement within the district, working conditions, possible town hall, better discipline in the classroom, consistent expectations was added to that. Perfect attendance summer, winter bonus was added on to pay, and then employee satisfaction, and that's all. I did. All right, that's all of our items.
All right, thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and board members for your input. So our next steps of what we're going to do is we are going to look at all of this and actually look at where the board prioritized. What were some of those things that were starred as indicators for priority? And then we are going to turn those into our priority statements, our goal statements. And then as a board, we will establish some metrics and assess our progress. We'll want to determine how often we want to actually talk about these things and review these goals. And I will say, in meeting with our superintendent, we will probably be talking about these things very often, because a lot of this is tied to our strategic plan as well as goals that our superintendent has set for herself as well. We'll talk about some of the progress that we're making, any challenges and concerns, and of course, we do want to celebrate success, because our success as a district is dependent on every person in this room and across the district. We'll also look at means of engaging our stakeholders. That actually came up several times. And then we also, because we're policymakers, we want to review any necessary policies to ensure that we are consistent and that we are creating a collaborative commitment to staying focused to these goals. And those policies include our BA board operational goals, and then even our BAA, our board self-evaluation as well. And so board members, again, our next steps, we will look at all of this, we will put it in a chart, we'll send it out, and then from there we will go ahead and determine where we want to set our priorities for the school year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Porter. Board members, are there any questions or comments? Any discussion? Well, thank you so much for participating, and that's a huge list, but I think we are able to take on that task. So I just want to say thank you so much for that. If there are no other questions, may I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mrs. Washington?
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the December 17, 2024 special call board meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
The motion has been made by Mrs. Washington and seconded by Mr. Dennis to adjourn the meeting. Board members, please vote. And we can take a hand vote. All in favor, raise your right hand. The vote is 6 yes, 0 no. The motion passes. The meeting is now adjourned.